As a 6, 7, 8, and 9-year-old boy, there were two coexisting elements of my chess education. There was my study with my teacher, Bruce Pandolfini, where we worked on the endgame and middle game principles and studied the great games of old masters. And there was the street side of my game, where I played with my buddies in New York City's Washington Square Park, let loose, had a blast, put myself on the line, focused through the distractions, and learned from my mistakes. So I was learning from the ground up, and I was having fun and expressing myself through chess. This balance of taking on your weaknesses, building from a solid foundation, and being true to your strengths, having fun, expressing yourself through your play, is perhaps our greatest challenge. You've already seen some endgame wins. Now I'll show you a park-style game I played as a kid, opening up the position early, taking big risks, and going right after the guy. One thing you'll notice is the intimidation factor. My opponent, Erez Klein, was a rival of mine who had a bit of a fearful chess persona, even though he was a very strong player. In this kind of matchup, I tended to be very aggressive. This game was played when I was 13 years old. He played d4, knight f6, c4. I played c5, headed for a very aggressive opening I loved, called the Benko Gambit. He played d5, which is the typical response. If he takes on c5, he's given up his central pawn, and he can't hold on to it. I can win it back with moves like knight a6 or e6. Eventually, I'll win that pawn back, and I'll have a better central control. He played d5, and here I played the gambit b5. Right from the start, I'm determining the style of the game. The Benko Gambit is a very aggressive opening that I started playing when I was 13, and I never lost touch with. If you look at my annotated games, you'll see one with the same opening against the same rival years later, where I won with a dangerous queen sacrifice. In this game, Erez tried to turn down the Benko. He played c takes b5, a6. This is the idea of the opening. I'm giving up a pawn. If he plays b takes a6, there's no way to win back the material right away. But I'm going to play g6, put my bishop on this long diagonal. I'm going to capture this with my bishop here, and I'm going to gain wonderful counterplay. This was the kind of opening I loved to throw at opponents when I was feeling aggressive. Sacrifice a pawn for some kind of positional dynamic and build up an attack. Risky, but just in my style. So Erez played knight c3 here, turning down the Benko Gambit. A typical way it's accepted is to play the move b takes a6. Now I can't win back material right away, but the way I tend to play here is g6, knight c3, and then play bishop takes a6. To give you a sense of a typical Benko position, he could play moves like knight f3, bishop g7, g3. I would play d6, bishop g2, knight bd7, and now you can see I have a wonderful bishop on the long diagonal. My other bishop is very strong, and my plan is to play castles, queen a5 or queen b6, rook f to b8. I've got rooks shooting down the queen side. His bishop is sometimes pinned down on c1. He's up a pawn, but I've got a wonderful pressure on his game. And also the endgames are very good out of the Benko. My pawn structure is so good, and my bishop on g7 is so strong. And he has some long-term weaknesses. So often you can even trade down towards an endgame in the Benko when you're down a little bit of material, and it'll still be good for you. It's a wonderful opening, very rich play. But notice when I'm describing the ideas of this opening, I'm not telling you to memorize variations. I'm not saying, if he does this, do this. I'm showing the ideas, where you want to place your pieces generally, the types of principles you want to use, the types of pressure you want to put on the opponent. This is the way to confront openings, not with memorizing variations, but with learning the principles, the structures of the game. So you can learn to understand the strategic dynamics of various positions and put them into motion, combine them with one another. Don't memorize, think in principles. After knight c3, a takes b5, Erez played e4, turning down the Benko Gambit and playing for a different type of central control. I played b4, knight b5, and here I played d6. You see what he had in mind for me after knight takes e4? This was a trap. White to play. What would you do here? Okay, queen e2 is a very good move. Now the knight on e4 has to go somewhere, but if it goes back to f6, here, white to move. What should you do? Exactly. Checkmate. You see, the pawn on e7 is pinned to the king. It can't move. The king has nowhere to run. It's mothered mate. So, his trap was, if I play knight takes e4, he plays queen e2, the knight can't go anywhere. If it goes to f6, knight d6 is mate. If it goes to d6, of course, knight takes d6 is still mate. If I defend it with f5, he can just attack it again with f3. I'm going to lose a piece. I have to allow him to take that knight with his pawn, because if I move it, knight d6 is brutal. Notice, of course, the knight on d6 guards that f7 square. It doesn't matter that the pawn moves. So I can't take on e4. Here I played d6. Perfectly fine. Consolidating. He played bishop f4. So, from the very start, I sacrificed a pawn, played the Benko gambit. He declined it. Now, once again, I pushed the envelope. I played an incredibly dynamic, risky move. g5. It would be difficult for me to tell you the principles behind this move. It's aggressive. It's opening things up, gaining a tempo, taking a big risk. I was establishing control of the tone of the battle, making my opponent psychologically uncomfortable. Here he played bishop takes g5, the only good move, and you'd expect me to play knight takes e4, but I didn't. I played bishop g7. Surprising. I'm playing without any feeling of materialism here. I've given up a pawn now, just to gain a little bit of a tempo in my development. I understand that he's got this long-term, shady thing happening with this knight on b5. You see, the knight on b5 is a good outpost, but it's also risky. I can maybe win that piece later on. So I've given up material, also given up king safety down the road, to gain some time. Now I want to take on e4. He played bishop d3. Now, you understand how I'm playing here. I'm playing tactically, pushing him around, establishing the tone of the battle. I played a crazy move, c4. Kicking the bishop once again. If his bishop goes back, I've gained a very powerful queen set expansion, and his knight on b5 is looking very vulnerable because his bishop is no longer defending it. I can play queen b6 or queen a5, attacking the knight. If he plays bishop takes c4, then I would play knight takes e4. You see, I've removed the defender of the e4 pawn. After knight takes e4, I'm threatening his bishop. I'm also eyeing the b2 pawn. He'd have to go back all the way bishop to c1, defending that pawn. And now I can continue with my development. I've got a good central knight. I've got a bishop on a long diagonal. His bishop is pinned down to the defense of the b2 pawn. His knight is a little bit exposed on b5. He's up a pawn, but I've sacrificed that pawn for a long-term dynamic. This was a typical Josh decision. Take big risks, make the position crazy, and outplay my opponent in the madness. I love this kind of game. The funny thing about this move c4 is that I'm giving him a choice. Do you want to win a pawn, or do you want to win the exchange? By exchange, I mean, of course, knight for rook, or bishop for rook. Here, playing c4, if he takes on c4, I would take on e4, and he'd be up a pawn. His other option, which is what he decided to do, was rook c1. He's trusting me. After bishop takes c4, it's not at all clear that my position is good. He's believing me. Okay, rook c1. It's funny, I didn't realize it, but I was told years later that a bunch of my rivals had all conferred, and for years had the strategy against me of declining my sacrifices. When I would offer a pawn sacrifice or a piece sacrifice for an attack, they'd just turn it down, not take the piece, defend against the attack. While this might have seemed clever, they were actually playing into my hands, allowing me to dictate the tone of the battle, while they were running scared. I was winning the mental game with my confident and aggressive play, and the reason I was able to feel confident was because I was playing Josh chess that was true to myself. So here he declines the sacrifice, but later on, I'll push the tone of the battle. So, instead of taking on c4, he played the move rook c1. An interesting decision, trying to win the exchange, but I had planned for that. I took on d3. He played knight c7 check, forking my rook and king, but no problem. I played king f8. Now if he takes on a8 right away, I can play the move knight takes e4. And here you can probably feel why black's game is so strong. I'm threatening his bishop on g5. Let's say he makes the move bishop back to d2. What would you do now? If he goes back to d2, for one thing, I can take his pawn on b2, attacking his rook on c1. If his rook moves, I can then think about taking his knight, putting a bishop on c3, or I can go back to d4, threatening the f2 square. I have this incredible central control. I've got a pawn on d3. I can always move my bishop out to a6. His knight on a8 is very strange. I've got a great attack. This position is pretty bad for white. So instead of allowing that, he played bishop takes f6. He doesn't want to allow knight takes e4. I don't really blame him. But he's given up his bishop, which makes my bishop even stronger. I play bishop takes f6, and now this dark square guy can run unopposed for the rest of the game. He plays knight takes a8, and now you're black. What should you do? Perfect. Bishop takes b2. Now I'm attacking the rook on c1. I'm also eyeing the move bishop c3 check, which makes him move the king, so he can't castle. Here my opponent played the risky move, rook c7, jumping down. He's putting the rook on the 7th rank. It's defended by his knight on a8. This is an interesting decision, maybe not the best. This is a totally wild position, just what I wanted to create. At the moment, he's up material. He has a rook for a bishop, but that's okay. I played knight a6, attacking his rook. Now he played the move rook a7, which was a bad move. You think about the downward spiral. He played rook c7, I played knight a6. He didn't want to admit that rook c7 was maybe not the best decision. He played rook a7, getting his rook trapped too deep into my board. What he should have done, take a deep breath, find the best move, get his clarity of mind back, play rook c4. Now here I like my position very much. Maybe I would play knight c5, followed by bishop a6. Maybe I'd play bishop c3 check. This is a great position. After rook a7, he's trying to hold it all together, but he can't quite do it. What should we do now? Well, I began with bishop c3 check. The point is, his rook on a7 can be attacked. He's put it too deep in my game. This happens quite often when you're the aggressor in a chess game. The opponent gets spooked by your confidence and aggression, and doesn't defend with a clear head. After bishop c3 check, the king goes to f1. Now, he doesn't have the option of knight f3 and castling to safety. I play bishop c3, a tiny little addition to the position, just to maximize my advantage. He plays king f1. And now what do you play? No, that's not the best move. Try again. Well done. Our idea all along. Bishop to d4. Going after that rook. He's got to get something for it. He doesn't want to give it up for nothing. Rook takes a6. Bishop takes a6. Now, I'm attacking his knight on a8. He played knight f3. What should you do now? Okay, you see that your bishop is attacked. You also see he's trying desperately to gain some counterplay. Maybe he wants to play knight g5. Do you remember the relationship between the bishop and knight, where I said if there's two squares between them, the bishop dominates the knight? Bishop f6. It's a very good move that stops all of white's counterplay. The knight can't move. It's completely dominated. Can't go to h4, can't go to g5, e5 and d4 are covered. Next move, I can take his knight on a8 and win the game. In this position, actually, my opponent resigned. He was bereft. There's nothing he can do. I have this great pawn on d3. I have two bishops. I'm winning this piece. I'll be up a piece next move. His king is stuck in the middle of the board. It's all over. So from beginning to end, I dominated the tone of this game. I offered a sacrifice. He refused it. I offered another sacrifice. He took it. Then I offered another one, allowing him to take an exchange, but in turn, he had a knight deep in my board, too deep. It got stuck in there. Then I brought another piece in. I allowed him to bring his rook down to c7 and to a7, so he had his rook and his knight both deep, deep, deep in my position. That might seem good to you from the outside, but in fact, they got stuck in there. One of the problems with being too aggressive on an external, superficial level, in other words, putting your pieces too deep into the opponent's position until you have a legitimate attack, is that you can get stuck in there and lose your fighters. That's what happened. This game was all about playing with a free spirit, determining the tone of the battle, and loving the game.